In the previous lecture, we started talking about defining scope, and in that lecture, we determined that one of the ways that we determine the scope of our program is by understanding our jurisdiction and the applicable legal, regulatory, and policy requirements. Well, part of determining that is going to be determining the regulatory model that we fall under. And we may fall under multiple regulatory models. And so in this lecture, we're going to discuss regulatory models and challenges. Very briefly, I'm going to name the 4 models that we're going to be looking at throughout this lecture. We're then going to talk about scope challenges and how to approach scoping. We're also going to discuss what to do when there are no or unknown requirements. And then we're going to look at the 4 regulatory models through specific jurisdictions. We're going to look at the sectoral approach in the United States. We're going to look at the comprehensive approach in the EU, Canada, and United Kingdom. We're going to look at the co-regulatory approach in Australia, and then we're going to look at the self-regulatory approach in the US, Japan, and Singapore. And no, that's not a mistake. There are multiple regulatory models in the United States. Again, the 4 regulatory models we're going to discuss here are sector-specific, comprehensive, co-regulatory, and self-regulatory. You need to remember these 4. You need to be able to define them, and you need to be able to connect them with specific examples. And we're going to cover all of that in this lecture. Some challenges to know ahead of time. It can often be difficult to identify the laws and regulations that apply to your organization. This can be challenging if you're operating in multiple jurisdictions or if you are a truly global organization. In that case, it might be ideal to divide and conquer. And what I mean by divide and conquer is you have different offices that specialize in particular regions. Other challenges include identifying industry-specific standards, operating in multiple jurisdictions, as I just said, and understanding the cultural norms throughout the different jurisdictions within which your organization might operate. When it comes to scoping, a good way to approach this process is to understand the complete data lifecycle. This is something we mentioned in the previous lecture. Remember, you want to understand everything from the point of collection all the way through to the point of destruction. Ideally, for all of the systems or projects that are collecting and processing data, you would have a data map or data flow diagram. Similarly, if your organization is a truly global organization, you're going to want to take a global perspective. And this means tailor and customizing your approaches and policies as appropriate. Similarly to cultural norms, you also want to understand linguistic norms as well as enforcement nuances. Really, in order to do that effectively, you need to find local folks who understand these processes, understand the culture, and can appropriately translate that to the stakeholders as necessary. And of course, privacy is not a one and done activity. You are going to want to monitor continuously and keep up with all new and emerging legal compliance requirements. For areas in which you operate where there are no or unknown requirements, it should not be the wild, wild west. The recommendation instead is to apply your organization's highest standards to that area. For this part moving forward in the lecture, we're going to talk about each of the 4 major regulatory models. Again, sectoral, comprehensive, co-regulatory, and self-regulatory. We've spoken briefly about the sectoral model already. The sectoral model addresses a specific sector or industry. Examples that we looked at are healthcare, finance, children's data, telecommunications, etc. And some of the laws that we have already looked at include HIPAA, GLBA, FCRA, TCPA, COPPA. We have looked at the term covered entities, which falls under HIPAA. We've looked at the Federal Trade Commission and its enforcement of COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And in the United States, in addition to sectoral regulation, there are also state-specific laws. So we have federal laws, such as the ones that we just looked at. And then we have state-specific ones, such as the California Consumer Privacy Act, which we've discussed. And the other one I have here, VCDPA, this is the Virginia state-specific privacy law. Now, the comprehensive approach is much broader, and what the comprehensive approach does, and an example of this is the GDPR, is it broadly applies to all sectors and industries. With the comprehensive model, privacy and data protection are fundamental rights, not just consumer protection issues, and there are general sets of principles that guide this legislation. So we've looked at the FIPS, for example, the Fair Information Practice Principles, or the Fair Information Practices. And we also looked in Domain 1 at the OECD guidelines and the APEC privacy framework. Those are 3 examples of general principles that are present throughout this comprehensive approach. Similarly, with the comprehensive model, an official oversight agency remedies problems and provides guidance. The co-regulatory approach is similar to the comprehensive model. The difference is that industry develops a standard that is then overseen by a privacy agency, and that privacy agency may be a government agency. And an example of an area that follows a co-regulatory model is Australia. The final of the 4 regulatory models that we're going to look at is the self-regulatory model. We looked at a couple examples of this in a recent lecture. Under the self-regulatory model, an industry body creates and enforces a code of practice. Examples include the Online Privacy Alliance, TrustArc, and WebTrust, and we can find examples in the US, Japan, and Singapore. In this lecture, we have discussed regulatory models and challenges. Challenges include identifying laws and regulations, industry-specific standards, and the multiple jurisdictions under which your organization falls. Similarly, identifying cultural norms can also be a challenge. With regards to approaching scoping, you want to understand the complete data lifecycle, take a global perspective, understand linguistic and enforcement nuances, and monitor all legal compliance requirements. When there are no or unknown requirements, it's important that your organization applies its highest standards. And finally, the 4 models we discussed and which you should commit to memory are sectoral, comprehensive, co-regulatory, and self-regulatory.